I walked through the door after my surgery, still struggling to stay on my feet. My brother, without missing a beat, shouted, "You are home at last. Stop acting like you are dying and get the dinner ready." What he did not know was that a very powerful man was standing right behind me, hearing every single word, and what happened next took everyone by surprise. My name is Samantha, and I am 33 years old. I work as a financial forensic investigator. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to walk all over you. For the past 4 days, I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from a ruptured appendix. It was an emergency surgery that nearly killed me. When the doctors told me to call my emergency contacts, I dialed my brother Brandon and my parents dozens of times. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Not one of them bothered to pick up or text back. I was completely alone in that hospital room until my biggest corporate client stepped in. Harrison Brooks is the CEO of Brooks Ventures. I had just spent the last 3 months untangling a massive embezzlement scheme within his company, saving his firm millions of dollars. When he found out I was stranded at the hospital after my discharge, he personally drove me home in his private car. The pain in my abdomen was a sharp burning sensation with every single step I took. The painkillers were wearing off, and my surgical incision felt like it was tearing open all over again. I clutched my side, leaning heavily against the doorframe of my own home in the Seattle suburbs. I had bought this 4-bedroom house 2 years ago with my own hard-earned money. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it had been hijacked. I managed to push the front door open, expecting at least a tiny bit of quiet so I could rest. Instead, the living room sounded like a chaotic war zone. The television volume was blasting at maximum capacity. Empty pizza boxes and crushed soda cans littered the expensive hardwood floors I had paid to restore. And right in the middle of the mess was my 36-year-old brother, Brandon. He was slouched on my custom leather sofa, wearing dirty sweatpants and aggressively smashing the buttons on his gaming controller. He did not even bother to pause his video game or turn around when I stumbled inside. He just yelled over the loud noise of the television screen. "Well, you are finally back. Stop acting like you are dying and get into the kitchen. Monique is starving and I need my dinner. You are making way too much noise breathing like that, and I'm trying to live stream to my followers." I stood there frozen in absolute disbelief. My medical gauze was literally seeping blood through my shirt. My face was pale and covered in cold sweat. And my own brother was ordering me to cook for him and his wife. Brandon was supposed to be building a revolutionary tech startup, a brilliant company that my parents constantly bragged about to all their friends. In reality, he was a 36-year-old freeloader who had moved into my house temporarily 6 months ago and simply refused to leave. Before I could even form the words to respond to his ridiculous demand, the sound of heavy footsteps came stomping down the wooden staircase. It was my sister-in-law, Monique. She is an African-American woman who calls herself a luxury lifestyle influencer on social media. She swept into the living room holding a ring light and her phone glaring at me as if I had just tracked dark mud across her personal palace. "Samantha, finally!" Monique snapped, crossing her arms over her expensive silk robe. That robe was bought using money Brandon constantly borrowed from our parents. "I have been waiting for you all day. You promised you would deep clean the recording studio before you went on your little hospital vacation. The lighting in there is terrible right now, and the dust is ruining my aesthetic. I have 3 brand deals to film by tomorrow morning." The recording studio she was complaining about was actually my master bedroom. When they first moved in, Monique claimed she needed the room with the best natural light for her videos. My parents had guilt-tripped me for weeks, telling me that family supports family, until I finally gave up my own bedroom and moved into the cramped guest room down the hall. I let them take over my space because I was too exhausted from working 80-hour weeks to fight them. I leaned against the entryway console table, my vision blurring slightly from the intense physical pain. "Monique!" I whispered, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube they had used during my surgery. I literally just had my appendix removed. I cannot cook for you, and I definitely cannot clean anything. I need to go upstairs and lie down right now. Brandon finally paused his game and turned around, looking at me with pure annoyance. He rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh. You always have to make everything about you, do you not? It was just a minor surgery, Samantha. Mom had her gallbladder out 10 years ago, and she was making us breakfast the very next morning. You are just using this as an excuse to be lazy and avoid helping us out. Monique has a lot of pressure on her right now with her brand deals. You are being completely selfish. Monique nodded in agreement, walking over to stand next to Brandon. Exactly, she sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. We are doing you a massive favor by staying here and keeping this big, empty house from feeling so lonely. The least you could do is pull your weight around here. Now go wash your hands and start chopping those vegetables. I have a strict diet plan to maintain for my followers. I felt a hot wave of rage rising deep in my chest, completely overpowering the physical agony of my surgical wound. I had spent years letting my family walk all over me. I let my parents treat me like an endless bank account. I let Brandon act like the golden child who could do no wrong. I had let them gaslight me into believing that my success meant nothing if I was not serving their needs. But standing there bleeding in the hallway of the house, I bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears, the illusion finally shattered into a million pieces. I opened my mouth to scream at them, to tell them to pack their bags and get out of my house immediately. But I did not have to say a single word, because Brandon and Monique had been so busy degrading me that they failed to notice the front door was still wide open. They failed to see the sleek black luxury car idling in my driveway. And most importantly, they completely failed to notice the tall, imposing shadow of a man stepping into the entryway right behind me. Harrison Brooks had stood there in complete silence for the last 3 minutes, listening to every vile, entitled word that came out of my brother and sister-in-law's mouths. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he stepped past me, his dark, tailored suit sharply contrasting with the chaotic mess of my living room, ready to show them exactly what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Harrison Brooks moved past me, his tall, broad-shouldered frame instantly blocking out the pale afternoon light streaming through the open doorway. His presence alone was enough to command absolute silence in any corporate boardroom, and here in the middle of my ruined living room, he looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage of noisy, clueless birds. He wore a charcoal gray, bespoke Tom Ford suit that easily cost more than Brandon had earned in his entire adult life. In his left hand, he gently held the white paper bag containing my post-surgery antibiotics. In his right hand, he held absolutely nothing, yet his clenched fist showed exactly how much restraint he was actively exercising. The loud, obnoxious explosions from the video game on the television screen continued to blast through the speakers, but the room itself had gone completely dead. Brandon froze on the sofa, his thumbs hovering stiffly over his gaming controller. Monique lowered her bright ring light, her eyes darting from Harrison's immaculate leather shoes to the customized platinum watch gleaming on his wrist. She knew money when she saw it, but her arrogant nature would not allow her to simply back down. Harrison did not blink, his icy blue eyes locked directly onto my brother, slicing through the tense air in the room. So this is how you treat the financial forensic analyst who just saved my company from a $40 million loss. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It possessed that quiet, dangerous frequency of a power player, the kind of man who could destroy your entire livelihood with a single phone call. He walked further into the room, stepping over a crushed soda can on my expensive hardwood floor with visible disgust. I brought her home because she was bleeding and exhausted from a major surgical procedure. Harrison continued, his tone razor sharp. And I walk in here to find you screaming at her to cook your dinner. Brandon blinked rapidly, his small mind struggling to process what was happening. He dropped his gaming controller onto the stained sofa cushions and stood up abruptly. He was wearing dirty sweatpants and a wrinkled graphic shirt, but he tried to puff out his chest, attempting to assert some kind of bizarre patriarchal dominance over the situation. He pointed an aggressive finger at Harrison. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Brandon shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to project an authority he did not possess. "You cannot just walk into my house and start talking down to me. I am the man of this house. Get out right now before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." Monique stepped forward, planting her hands firmly on her hips. She flipped her long hair over her shoulder, completely missing the sheer gravity of the situation. "Exactly. This is private property. You cannot just waltz in here in a fancy suit and disrespect my husband. Brandon is a tech founder. He is a very important man in this city. You are trespassing on his property, and Samantha needs to explain why she is bringing random disrespectful men into our home without our explicit permission." Harrison stopped walking. He looked at Brandon, then at Monique, and then he let his gaze sweep around the trash-filled living room. The corner of his mouth twitched in a cold, humorless smile. "Your house." Harrison repeated the words slowly, as if he were tasting something incredibly rotten. He turned his head to look back at me. I was still leaning heavily against the entryway wall, clutching my bleeding side, struggling to stay upright. "Samantha, are these the relatives you mentioned, the ones you generously allowed to stay temporarily while they allegedly looked for their own place?" I took a shallow breath, the pain radiating through my core, but I nodded. "Yes, Mr. Brooks. That is my brother Brandon and his wife Monique." Brandon crossed his arms, trying to maintain his tough guy act, despite the nervous sweat forming on his forehead. "Listen here, buddy. I do not care if you are her boss, her client, or her boyfriend. This is family business. Samantha owes us. We are staying here to keep an eye on her place and make sure she behaves. This is my property right now, and I make the rules. So turn around, walk out that door, and mind your own business." Harrison let out a low, mocking laugh. It was a dark, intimidating sound that had undoubtedly made top-tier executives sweat during hostile negotiations. He took a deliberate step closer to Brandon. The height difference was glaring. Harrison towered over him, forcing my brother to tilt his head up slightly just to maintain eye contact. "Let me get this straight," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You claim to be a tech founder, a man of importance, yet you spend your Tuesday afternoon screaming at a woman who just had emergency surgery, demanding she cook a hot meal for you in a house you do not even own. You leave garbage all over the floor. You occupy her master bedroom, and you have the sheer audacity to tell me that I am disrespecting you." Brandon's face flushed bright red. His fragile ego was cracking violently under Harrison's relentless gaze. "I said this is my house," Brandon yelled, taking a defensive step backward. "I am the man of the family. Samantha is just a woman. She does not know how to manage a large property like this anyway. I am protecting the family assets. I am the one in charge." Monique pulled out her smartphone and held it up high, pointing the camera lens directly at Harrison's face. "I am recording this," she threatened, her voice shrill and demanding. "I have thousands of followers. I will expose you on the internet. I will show everyone how you are attacking a Black female creator and a successful entrepreneur in their own home. You are going to be cancelled. What is your name? Tell my followers your name so they can ruin your life." Harrison did not even flinch at the camera lens pointing at him. He simply looked at Monique with an expression of absolute pity. "Go ahead and record," Harrison said smoothly, completely unbothered. "Press record and live stream it to all your followers if you want. Let the entire internet see exactly who you really are. Because in a few minutes you are going to need a completely new background for your little videos." I watched from the entryway, leaning my aching body against the painted drywall. My breathing was shallow. Every inhalation sent a sharp spike of agony through my stitched abdomen. Yet for the first time in 6 long months, I did not feel the crushing weight of despair in this house. I felt a massive spark of vindication. Harrison Brooks was a man who commanded thousands of employees. He brokered international deals and dismantled corrupt corporate executives before breakfast. Watching my unemployed brother and his fake influencer wife try to intimidate him was like watching a feral dog bark at a moving freight train. Harrison calmly placed the white pharmacy bag gently on the clean corner of the entryway table, ensuring my medication was safe. Then he turned his full attention back to the parasites infesting my living room. He reached his hands up and calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket, letting it fall open in a relaxed, dominant manner. He was not preparing for a physical fight. He was preparing for a brutal execution. "You keep using that phrase," Harrison said, keeping his eyes locked on Brandon. "My house, my property. That is a very bold claim for a man who does not pay a single utility bill." Harrison did not waste his breath engaging in a screaming match. Men of his stature never needed to raise their voices to command a room. Instead, he smoothly reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew his smartphone. His movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely unbothered by the circus unfolding in front of him. He did not look at the glowing ring light Monique was pointing at his face. He simply tapped his screen a few times, his eyes scanning the digital information he pulled up within seconds. "The King County Public Property Portal is a wonderfully transparent tool," Harrison stated. His voice cut through the tense atmosphere with clinical precision. "It is amazing the kind of data you can find when you know exactly where to look. Let us review the facts, shall we?" Brandon crossed his arms, shifting his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "Facts about what? I told you this is my property. You are trespassing." Harrison did not look up from his screen. According to the official deed registered with the county, this 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom residence was purchased in 2021. The sole owner listed on the title is Samantha Miller. There are no CO signers. There is no Brandon Miller. There is no Monique Miller. Furthermore, the property records indicate there is zero outstanding mortgage on this estate. She owns it outright. Harrison finally raised his eyes, locking them onto Brandon. His gaze was utterly suffocating. "You do not own this house. You do not hold equity in this house. Based on the utility accounts linked to this address, which I happen to know, because your sister used my firm's secure network to pay them last week, you have not contributed a single dime to the electricity, the water, or the property taxes in the last 6 months. You are not a homeowner. You are not a landlord. You are a freeloader, living off the hard work of a woman who just had her organs sliced open." The sheer factual brutality of Harrison's words hit Brandon like a physical blow. The aggressive posture instantly melted away from my brother's frame. The false bravado he used to intimidate me his entire life vanished the second he was confronted by a man who saw right through his pathetic facade. Brandon opened his mouth to argue, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He stammered, searching for any excuse to salvage his shattered ego. "That is just paperwork," Brandon stuttered, taking another step back. "It is family equity. I am the oldest son. We have a verbal agreement. I am advising her on her real estate investments while I build my tech company. You cannot even manage to put your empty pizza boxes in the recycling bin." Harrison replied, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. "I highly doubt you are advising anyone on real estate investments. You are nothing but a squatter throwing a temper tantrum." Monique immediately realized that the aggressive alpha male strategy had completely failed. Harrison Brooks could not be intimidated by loud noises, empty threats, or a smartphone camera. He had systematically dismantled her husband's authority with a few taps on a screen. The internet would never side with a couple of squatters refusing to pay rent and harassing a sick woman. Her influencer narrative was dead on arrival. Without missing a beat, Monique swiftly lowered her phone. She tapped the screen to stop her recording, realizing that broadcasting this humiliation would completely ruin her fake luxury aesthetic online. But Monique was nothing if not a master manipulator. If she could not play the fierce, untouchable creator, she would instantly switch to her backup role. She would become the helpless victim, her face contorted into an expression of exaggerated terror. Her bottom lip began to tremble and she dramatically gasped for air, as if she were suddenly under physical attack. She aggressively swiped at her phone screen, bypassing her social media apps and going straight to her speed dial. She put the phone on speaker, making sure the volume was turned all the way up so I could hear exactly what she was doing. The line rang twice before my mother Linda picked up. "Hello, Monique, sweetheart?" Linda's voice came through the speaker, dripping with that sickeningly sweet affection she reserved entirely for her daughter-in-law and her golden boy son. "How is my beautiful daughter doing today? Is Brandon working hard on his new software code? Mom, Linda, you have to get over here right now," Monique wailed into the phone. She forced a realistic-sounding sob from her throat, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "We are in danger. It is Samantha. She has completely lost her mind." I groaned, squeezing my eyes shut as a fresh wave of pain radiated from my surgical incision. The stress of standing in the hallway was taking a massive toll on my body, but I could not look away from the absolute theater production playing out in my living room. "What do you mean she lost her mind?" Linda demanded, her tone instantly shifting from sweet to fiercely defensive. "Did she complain about cleaning the house again? I told her to make sure you two were fed. It is worse than that." Monique cried out, clutching her chest for dramatic effect. "She just barged into the house, and she brought some dangerous, aggressive thug with her. He is a giant man in a suit, and he is threatening Brandon. Brandon was just sitting here quietly working so hard on his startup, coding his fingers to the bone to make you proud, and Samantha brought this criminal into our home to terrorize us. He is threatening to throw us out on the street. He is verbally attacking your son." There was a sharp gasp on the other end of the line. The sound of something crashing to the floor, probably a plate or a glass, echoed through the speaker. My mother was hyperventilating with rage. She brought a violent man into the house to threaten my son. Linda screamed into the receiver. "How dare she? How dare she try to intimidate her own brother when he is on the verge of becoming a tech billionaire?" "Do not move, Monique. You tell Brandon to protect himself. Richard and I are getting in the car right now. We are coming over there to teach that ungrateful brat a lesson she will never forget. Do not let that man touch my son." Monique ended the call, leaving a tense, echoing silence in her wake. She wiped a fake tear from the corner of her eye and looked at me with a triumphant, malicious smirk. "You are finished, Samantha. Mom and Dad are on their way. You are going to be so sorry you ever tried to disrespect us." I leaned heavily against the wall, my legs trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. I had endured their manipulation for 33 years, but watching them twist reality right in front of my eyes was still nauseating. Harrison did not look at them. He completely ignored Monique's theatrical performance and Brandon's pathetic attempts to look tough. Instead, he walked over to the heavy oak dining table near the kitchen. He pulled out one of the sturdy wooden chairs, picked it up easily with one hand, and carried it over to the entryway where I was standing. He set the chair down gently right behind me. "Sit," Harrison commanded softly, his voice shifting from cold steel to a quiet, protective warmth. "You are pale, Samantha. Do not strain your stitches for people who are not worth your energy. Let them call whoever they want. We are not going anywhere." I slowly lowered myself into the chair, letting out a shaky breath as the pressure came off my abdominal muscles. I looked up at Harrison, seeing the fierce, unyielding determination in his eyes. My parents were coming to tear me down, just like they always did. But for the very first time in my life, I was not standing alone in the dark. I had a predator of my own standing guard, and the real show was just about to begin. The screech of tires violently tearing into my driveway broke the tense silence of the room. Heavy footsteps pounded up the concrete walkway in a frantic rush. The front door, which Harrison had left slightly ajar, was thrown completely open, hitting the drywall with a loud, aggressive thud. Richard and Linda marched into the entryway like they were generals storming a battlefield. My mother was dressed in her usual pristine suburban attire, her hair perfectly styled, her expensive handbag clutched tightly in her grip. My father trailed right behind her, his chest puffed out, ready to play the role of the ultimate protector for his golden boy. I was sitting right there in the wooden chair Harrison had placed for me. I was directly in their line of sight. My face was pale, covered in a cold sweat, and the fresh blood from my surgical wound was visibly soaking through the fabric of my shirt. Any normal parent would have dropped everything in sheer panic, rushed to their child, and immediately called an ambulance. Linda did not even break her stride. She marched right past my bleeding body without a single glance of concern and rushed straight over to the sofa. "Oh, my poor boy," she cried, wrapping her arms around Brandon as if he had just survived a war zone. Monique immediately jumped into action, producing fake exaggerated sobs as she leaned heavily into my mother's shoulder. "Mom," it was terrifying, Monique whimpered, pointing a perfectly manicured nail toward the entryway. "Samantha brought this violent man here to throw us out on the street. We were just minding our own business, working hard on Brandon's company, and she unleashed him on us." Linda spun around, her eyes blazing with an irrational, misplaced fury. She let go of Brandon and marched right up to me, stopping just inches from where I sat, hunched over in agonizing pain. She pointed her finger directly at my face, her features twisted with absolute disgust. "How dare you!" Linda hissed, her voice vibrating with pure venom. "How dare you bring a complete stranger into this house to humiliate your brother and your sister-in-law? Just because you are 34 years old single and nobody wants to marry you does not mean you get to be jealous of Brandon's happy family. You are a bitter, miserable woman trying to ruin your brother's future." The words hit me exactly as she intended them to. For my entire life, this had been the script. I was the workaholic spinster who was never good enough. Brandon was the brilliant prince who deserved the world on a silver platter. I looked up at my mother, searching her eyes for even a fraction of an ounce of maternal concern. There was absolutely none. She saw my blood. She saw my physical agony. She simply did not care. Richard stepped forward aggressively, inserting himself into the confrontation. He looked at Harrison, his eyes scanning up and down, trying to size up the man standing in front of me. Richard was used to intimidating people. He was used to bullying my soft-spoken ex-boyfriends or talking down to my quiet coworkers. But Harrison Brooks was built like a heavyweight fighter and carried the cold, lethal aura of a man who could buy and sell Richard's entire retirement fund before his morning coffee. Still, my father's blind arrogance pushed him forward. "You?" Richard barked, pointing his thick finger directly at Harrison's chest. "I do not know who you are, and I do not care. This is a private family matter. You are going to turn around, walk out that door, and get off my property right now. Leave us alone so my wife and I can teach our daughter how to respect her blood relatives." Harrison did not move a single millimeter. He stood firmly between me and my father, his broad shoulders creating an impenetrable human shield. The sheer height and presence of Harrison made Richard look incredibly small and pathetic. Behind my parents, Brandon crossed his arms and smirked. He felt invincible again. His personal bodyguards had arrived to put me back in my place, to force me back into the role of the silent, obedient cash cow that existed only to fund his delusions of grandeur. Linda refused to stop. She leaned closer, her voice shrill and demanding. "You have always been so utterly selfish, Samantha. Brandon is working day and night on his tech startup. He is going to be a millionaire. He is carrying the family legacy. And what do? You go to the hospital for some minor stomach ache, milk it for attention, and come back acting like a martyr. And then you bring this thug here to threaten him." Harrison tilted his head slightly at the word thug. The corners of his mouth turned up into a terrifying, humorless smile, but he remained perfectly silent, waiting to see exactly how deep this family was willing to dig their own graves. I gripped the armrests of my wooden chair. The physical pain radiating from my abdomen was excruciating, but the boiling anger inside my chest was vastly stronger. I forced myself to sit up straighter, refusing to cower in front of them. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but laced with pure steel. "I had a ruptured appendix. I was on the operating table for hours. I almost died of sepsis." "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Linda snapped instantly, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "You are clearly fine enough to sit there and conspire against your brother. If you have the energy to bring men into this house, you have the energy to do your chores. You should be in the kitchen right now apologizing to Monique and making sure she has a hot meal. She is very stressed because of your toxic behavior today." Richard took another step toward Harrison, foolishly invading his personal space. "Did you hear me, boy?" Richard yelled, his face turning red. "I said get out of my house. I am the patriarch of this family and I am ordering you to leave." If you do not walk out that door in the next 5 seconds, I will personally throw you out onto the street." Harrison looked down at Richard's pointing finger, then slowly met the older man's eyes. The temperature in the room plummeted. "You are not going to throw anyone out," Harrison said. His voice was dangerously calm, a quiet rumble that sent a very clear warning. "In fact, you are not going to raise your voice again while standing in a house that you do not legally own. And if you point your finger at her one more time, I will make sure you never raise your hand to anyone ever again." The absolute chilling conviction in Harrison's voice made Richard freeze entirely. It was the unmistakable tone of a man who did not make empty threats, a man who possessed the means and the ruthlessness to destroy a life without blinking. Richard swallowed hard, taking an involuntary half-step backward. Linda gasped, clutching the collar of her expensive blouse in mock horror. "Richard, call the police!" Linda shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "This man is threatening us in our own home. Samantha, you are a complete disgrace to this family. You are completely dead to me until you get on your knees, beg your brother for forgiveness, and throw this criminal out." I looked at the four of them standing in my living room. My mother, my father, my brother, and his wife. A united front of pure, unadulterated toxicity. They were all standing there demanding my submission, demanding my resources, demanding my absolute obedience. They were so blinded by their own entitlement and their twisted family hierarchy that they had absolutely no idea they were standing in a puddle of gasoline, and I was the one holding the match. Harrison instinctively moved his broad shoulders, shifting his tailored frame to completely shield me from my mother's toxic rage. He extended his arm, creating a physical barrier to block Linda from taking another aggressive step toward me. It was a protective, fiercely loyal gesture, the kind I had never experienced in my entire 33 years of existence. But I slowly reached out and placed my hand gently against his arm. He looked down at me, his icy blue eyes softening for a fraction of a second. I shook my head silently. I did not want him to fight this particular battle for me. I had hidden behind my work, my exhaustion, and my silent suffering for far too long. Gritting my teeth against the searing white-hot pain radiating from my abdominal incision, I gripped the armrests of the wooden chair and forced myself to stand. Every muscle in my core screamed in absolute protest, and a fresh wave of dizziness washed over my vision, but I locked my knees and stood tall. I refused to let my parents look down on me from their imaginary moral high ground for one more second. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. Her face was flushed with self-righteous anger, fully expecting me to apologize, and retreat into the shadows like I always did. "You think I am jealous?" I asked, my voice dangerously steady, dropping to a cold analytical tone that I usually reserved for hostile corporate audits. "You think I am jealous of Brandon and his supposedly happy family? Let us talk about exactly how this happy family was built. Let us talk about the actual numbers, Mom, since you love to brag to the entire neighborhood about his massive success." My father scoffed, waving his thick hand dismissively in the air. "We are not talking about numbers right now, Samantha. We are talking about your severe lack of respect for your elders." "No, we are talking about exactly that." I shot back, my voice gaining volume and slicing right through his pathetic attempt to control the narrative. "Because 3 years ago, when your golden boy wanted to give Monique her dream luxury influencer wedding, he did not have a single dime to his name. And you two did not either. You had maxed out your credit cards covering his previous failed business ventures. So you came crying to me." Linda's face twitched, the color draining slightly from her cheeks as Harrison stood there, a silent, intimidating witness to her financial dirty laundry being aired out in broad daylight. "You sat in my cramped, freezing studio apartment and begged me." I continued, taking a slow, agonizing step forward. "You cried fake tears and begged me to lend you $150,000 from my personal savings account. That was the money I saved by working double shifts, by eating instant noodles for dinner, by skipping every single holiday and vacation since I graduated college. You swore on your lives it was just a temporary bridge loan. You looked me right in the eye and promised that Brandon's revolutionary tech app was mere weeks away from a massive buyout and he would pay me back every single penny with interest. That was an investment in your brother's future. Richard bellowed, his neck turning a mottled shade of red as he tried to defend his blatant extortion. Family helps family. It is a temporary setback, and he is going to make it all back tenfold. It was a total scam, I replied coldly, staring at my father with absolute disgust. That $150,000 did not go into a tech startup. It paid for a lavish, over-the-top destination wedding in Tulum. It paid for Monique's custom designer gown, the imported tropical flowers, and the luxury resort stay for all her fake internet friends so she could post photos and pretend she married a billionaire. It paid for a total lie, and not a single cent of that money has ever been returned to my bank account. I swept my hand toward the trash-filled living room, pointing at the empty pizza boxes and the expensive gaming console Brandon had left running. And now, 3 years later, your genius CEO son and his luxury influencer wife are living completely rent-free in a house that I purchased by myself. They eat the groceries that I pay for. They use the electricity that I pay for. They complain about the high-speed internet connection that I cover out of my own pocket every single month. So please, Mom, I dare you. Look me in the eye and tell me exactly what part of this pathetic parasitic existence I am supposed to be jealous of. The silence in the room was deafening. My parents were momentarily paralyzed by the sheer blunt force of the factual truth. I had never spoken to them this way, never weaponized the financial data that I had quietly tracked for years. Harrison watched the entire exchange with a look of profound respect, crossing his sharp features, letting me entirely dismantle their delusion. But Monique, entirely oblivious to the concept of shame and operating on a terrifying level of pure entitlement, stepped out from behind Brandon. She crossed her arms over her chest, the diamond wedding ring that I had practically paid for catching the light from the hallway fixtures. She tilted her head back, looking down her nose at me with unbelievable arrogance. That is the duty of a younger sister, Monique stated, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. Brandon is the firstborn son. He is the heir to the Miller family name. He carries the legacy of this bloodline. You are just a woman. You do not have a husband, and you clearly do not have children to support. You had excess cash sitting around in a bank account doing nothing, and it was your absolute obligation to invest it into your brother's public image. Family wealth belongs to the men who actually lead the family. You should be grateful we even allow you to be part of his journey to the top. I stared at Monique. Her chest was puffed out with the absurd pride of a woman who genuinely believed that my bank account was her birthright. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even bother to correct her delusional worldview. Debating with parasites only validates their existence. Instead of wasting another breath on my utterly toxic family, I reached into the sleek leather tote bag hanging heavily from my shoulder. The room fell into an uneasy, expectant silence. My parents watched my hands, probably assuming I was about to pull out my checkbook to appease them. Brandon crossed his arms, a victorious smirk already forming on his face, fully expecting me to surrender to their combined psychological abuse. Monique held her chin high, waiting for her freshly extorted apology. My fingers bypassed my wallet and closed around a thick, stiff manila folder. I pulled it out slowly. The heavy legal paper made a crisp, authoritative sound as it brushed against the leather of my bag. Right in the center of the top page was a glaring, unmistakable red stamp from the King County District Court. I stepped forward, ignoring the sharp stab of pain in my abdomen, and threw the folder directly onto the center of the hardwood coffee table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack that echoed in the quiet living room. Brandon flinched. Richard narrowed his eyes, leaning forward to squint at the bold black lettering printed across the top of the document. Linda just stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. I did not file this today. I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion, cold and mechanical like a machine processing data. I filed this paperwork 3 days ago, right before I collapsed in my office, and was rushed into emergency surgery. The court approved it immediately because you have zero legal tenancy rights, no lease agreement, and a documented history of paying absolutely nothing. Richard reached down with trembling hands and flipped open the cover of the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, and I watched the exact moment the blood completely drained from his face. The aggressive, domineering patriarch of the Miller family suddenly looked like a deflated balloon. "What is it, Richard?" Linda demanded, her voice shrill with sudden panic. "What did she do?" "It is a 3-day pay or quit notice." Richard muttered, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "It is a formal eviction order. It has a judge signature on it." I crossed my arms over my chest, standing as tall as my recovering body would allow. "You have exactly 72 hours to pack up every single piece of garbage you brought into my house and leave," I stated, locking eyes with Brandon. "I have already submitted copies of this court order to the local police precinct. If you are still standing on my property when that clock runs out, armed officers will arrive to physically escort you off the premises for trespassing." Brandon stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the sofa. He dropped heavily onto the cushions, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The reality of the red court stamp was short-circuiting his brain. He had spent months acting like the master of this estate, and in a single second, he was reduced to a legally documented squatter facing imminent police removal. "You cannot do this to us!" Monique shrieked, her influencer persona shattering into a million pieces of raw panic. "We have nowhere to go. Nowhere to... All of our money is tied up in Brandon Tech Company. You cannot just throw your own flesh and blood out onto the street like stray dogs." "This is a private residential home," I replied, my tone razor-sharp. "It is not a refugee camp for lazy, entitled adults who refuse to work. You wanted to act like a billionaire lifestyle creator on the internet. Now you can go figure out how to afford a hotel room with your massive social media following." Linda erupted, her face turning a vibrant shade of purple. "Samantha Miller, you withdraw this piece of trash right now!" she screamed, lunging forward as if she were going to physically attack me. "I am your mother, and I forbid you from treating your brother this way. You are destroying our family over a stupid house. We will sue you. We will take you to court and take everything you own." Before Linda could take another step toward me, Harrison moved. He did not run. He simply shifted his massive frame, stepping directly into Linda's path. His presence was like a concrete wall. He looked down at my mother, his blue eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "I highly suggest you reconsider your next move, Mrs. Miller." Harrison said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that instantly paralyzed her. "If you attempt to sue her, you will be going up against the corporate legal team of Brooks Ventures. We retain the most aggressive, ruthless attorneys in the state of Washington. I promise you, by the time my lawyers are done dismantling your lives, you will not even be able to afford a cardboard box to sleep in." Richard grabbed Linda's arm, yanking her back. The threat of facing a billionaire legal squad was enough to terrify a man who had spent his whole life bullying people who could not fight back. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pure hatred. "You are going to regret this, Samantha." Richard spat, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "You are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are completely dead to this family." I looked right back at him, feeling absolutely nothing but relief. The manipulation tactics that used to make me cry myself to sleep no longer worked. The guilt trips were completely useless. I had severed the invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck for 3 decades. "The countdown has already started," I said, pointing a steady finger toward the front door. "You have 72 hours. I suggest you stop screaming and start packing your bags." The Miller family stood frozen in the middle of my living room. They were completely dead silent, shell-shocked by the brutal, undeniable reality of the court order sitting on the table. They had come here to force my submission. They had come to break my spirit and remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of their twisted hierarchy. Instead, they had walked straight into a legal execution. Harrison stepped to my side, placing a warm, supportive hand lightly on the small of my back. He did not say another word to them. He simply guided me away from the toxic wreckage of my family, leading me toward the kitchen, so I could finally sit down and take my medication. The war was far from over, but the first fatal shot had been fired, and it had hit the target with devastating, absolute perfection. The heavy thumping of footsteps echoed through the ceiling like a herd of panicked animals. Brandon and Monique had sprinted up the stairs the second the eviction reality set in, completely abandoning their tough facade. Harrison handed me a glass of cold water and my pain medication. He stayed in the kitchen, giving me a silent nod of reassurance. He knew I needed a moment to breathe, but the frantic crashing noises from the second floor sent a sharp spike of anxiety straight into my chest. They were not just packing, they were ransacking my house. I swallowed the pill, gripped the edge of the kitchen island to steady my trembling legs, and forced myself to walk toward the staircase. Every step upward was a fresh wave of agony radiating from my stitched abdomen. I clutched the wooden banister, taking shallow breaths, refusing to let my physical weakness stop me. I knew exactly what kind of people my family members were. If they were going down, they would try to strip this house down to the copper wiring before they left. I reached the second-floor landing and pushed open the door to the master bedroom. The room was an absolute disaster zone. My beautiful, custom-designed sanctuary had been reduced to a chaotic dumping ground. Clothes were violently thrown across the floor. Expensive makeup palettes were smashed into my custom area rug. 3 massive ring lights were knocked over in the corner. Monique was standing in the middle of the mess, frantically shoving designer clothes and expensive shoes into a massive Louis Vuitton suitcase. Her hands were shaking with manic energy as she tore through the closet, grabbing anything that looked remotely valuable. I opened my mouth to tell her to pack only what belonged to her, but the words instantly died in my throat. The pale afternoon light caught a brilliant, unmistakable flash of silver and ice right against her collarbone. My heart completely stopped. Hanging around Monique's neck, resting casually against her cheap fabric top, was a vintage platinum chain carrying a flawless teardrop diamond. It was my grandmother's necklace. It was the only family heirloom I possessed, the only piece of genuine love and history I had left from the woman who actually raised me with kindness. My grandmother had given it to me on her deathbed, bypassing my mother and my brother entirely because she knew they would pawn it for quick cash. I had kept that necklace hidden away like a sacred relic. I never wore it. I never left it out. "Take that off right now," I said. My voice was no longer a weak post-surgery whisper. It was a cold, lethal command that cut through the chaotic noise of the room. Monique froze. She spun around, her eyes wide with a fleeting moment of guilt before her arrogant, entitled mask immediately slammed right back into place. She raised her hand and deliberately traced her manicured fingers over the teardrop diamond, a sickening smile stretching across her face. "I am not taking anything off," Monique sneered, tilting her chin up to look down at me. "This belongs to me now. Mom Linda gave it to me this morning before you decided to ruin everyone's day. She told me to go into your room and take it." My hands balled into tight fists. I ignored the screaming pain in my side and took a slow, measured step into the bedroom. My mother did not have the right to give away my property. That necklace belongs to me. It was left to me in a legally binding will. "Take it off before I call the police upstairs and have you arrested for grand larceny." Monique let out a loud, mocking laugh. She tossed a pair of shoes into her suitcase and crossed her arms, completely unbothered by my threat. "Call them," Monique challenged, stepping closer to me with an expression of pure, unfiltered venom. "Mom Linda said you do not deserve to keep family heirlooms. You are a 34-year-old spinster who cannot even keep a man. You are a worthless throwaway daughter who is going to die alone in this big empty house. What are you going to do with a piece of jewelry like this? Wear it to a corporate meeting. Wear it to a lonely dinner by yourself." She patted the diamond again, her eyes gleaming with narcissistic delusion. "Mom, Linda said this jewelry belongs to the wife of the firstborn son. It belongs to someone who actually carries the Miller family legacy. A high-profile piece like this requires a woman with a natural influencer aura. It requires someone who knows how to represent wealth and status to the world. I need it for my brand deals, Samantha. You are just a bitter accountant who crunches numbers all day. You do not have the aesthetic or the class to wear diamonds. The sheer audacity of her delusion was staggering. She was a broke squatter being evicted by a court order, yet she stood in my stolen bedroom wearing my stolen jewelry, lecturing me about class and wealth. I did not scream. I did not cry. The seething rage inside me crystallized into something utterly terrifying and calm. I walked straight up to Monique. I did not stop until I was standing inches from her face, invading her personal space with an energy so intensely hostile that she instinctively stepped backward, her heel hitting the edge of her open suitcase. "You have no brand," I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You have a fake internet life funded entirely by the money your husband steals from his parents. And right now you are standing in my house wearing stolen property." I raised my hand and pointed a single trembling finger directly at her chest. "I am going to count to 3. I stated, locking my eyes onto hers. "If that platinum clasp is not undone by the time I reach the number 3, I will not call the police. I will call Harrison Brooks upstairs, and I will let him handle a thief in whatever way he sees fit." Monique's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. The memory of Harrison's massive, intimidating frame standing in the living room was still fresh in her mind. She knew her husband was too cowardly to protect her from a man of that caliber. Her hands immediately flew to the back of her neck. Her perfectly manicured fingers fumbled frantically with the small metal clasp. 1. I counted, my voice completely dead and hollow. "Fine, take your stupid necklace," Monique hissed in a panicked rush. She yanked the platinum chain free and practically threw it into my outstretched hand. "You are psychotic. Mom Linda was right about you. You are a greedy, miserable monster." I closed my fingers tightly around the cool metal of the diamond pendant. The relief of having it back was immediate, but the victory was heavily overshadowed by a sudden, sickening realization. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the chaotic mess of the master bedroom, ignoring Monique's continued tantrum. My grandmother's necklace had not been sitting in a jewelry box on the dresser. It had not been tucked away in a drawer. I had locked that necklace inside a heavy steel digital safe hidden deep within the custom shelving of my walk-in closet. If Monique had the necklace, it meant someone had breached a secure code-protected vault. And I knew perfectly well that a fake influencer did not have the brain capacity to hack a digital keypad. My heart began to pound violently against my ribs as I looked toward the open door of the walk-in closet. I shoved the diamond necklace deep into the pocket of my pants and turned my back on Monique entirely. Her shrill voice complaining about my hostility faded into meaningless background noise. My entire focus was completely consumed by a sudden, chilling panic. I stepped over the piles of discarded designer clothes, ignored the burning sensation in my surgical wound, and pushed my way straight into the depths of my custom walk-in closet. I knew exactly where I had bolted my heavy steel digital safe. I had installed it myself behind a customized wooden false panel in the back wall, completely out of sight from anyone who did not know the exact dimensions of the shelving unit. It was designed to be virtually undetectable. The wooden false panel had been violently ripped away, its splintered edges exposing the bare drywall beneath. The heavy steel door of the safe was hanging wide open. The digital keypad had not been hacked by some sophisticated software. It had been brutally smashed with a heavy tool, likely a hammer or a crowbar, until the locking mechanism completely gave out. I stared at the ruined metal box, my breath catching in my throat. Monique was far too obsessed with her manicures to ever swing a hammer with enough force to shatter reinforced steel. This was Brandon. My brother had systematically destroyed my property to access my most highly classified personal files. I fell to my knees, biting my lip hard to suppress a cry of pain as my abdominal muscles contracted sharply. I frantically reached inside the dark cavity of the ruined safe. My jewelry boxes had been tossed aside, but that was not what I was looking for. I dug my hands into the bottom compartment where I kept my most sensitive physical documents, my social security card, my birth certificate. The original deed to my house, my past 5 years of highly detailed tax returns. The compartment was completely empty. A normal person might have just started crying. A normal person would have called the police immediately to report a standard burglary. But I was not a normal person. I was a senior financial forensic investigator who spent my entire career tracking down elite corporate embezzlers and dismantling complex monetary fraud rings. My professional instincts kicked in, overriding my physical agony with a massive icy wave of pure adrenaline. Brandon did not steal my tax returns and my property deed to sell them on the black market. He stole them because he needed to establish a comprehensive financial profile. I pushed myself off the closet floor, my mind racing at a terrifying speed. I ignored Monique, who was still standing in the bedroom complaining about her packed luggage. I grabbed my secure work laptop from its hidden compartment in the bottom drawer of my desk, flipped open the screen, and placed it on the nearest flat surface. My fingers flew across the keyboard with muscle memory, bypassing the standard startup screens and launching my encrypted virtual private network. I did not check my standard bank accounts. If Brandon wanted cash, he would have just stolen my debit cards. I went straight for the absolute core of my financial identity. I logged directly into the Federal Credit Bureau database, utilizing my professional credentials to pull a real-time, comprehensive hard inquiry on my own Social Security number. The loading icons spun on the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. When the dashboard finally materialized, the numbers staring back at me made the blood completely freeze in my veins. My credit score, which I had meticulously maintained at a flawless 810 for years, had violently plummeted. But that was not the horrifying part. Right at the top of the screen, under the active liabilities column, was a massive red flag indicating a brand new, highly leveraged financial account. It was a home equity line of credit. The principal balance was exactly $300,000. The account had been opened, fully approved, and completely disbursed just 2 weeks ago. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes tracking the data lines with ruthless precision. The loan was registered through a mid-sized regional bank that handled expedited digital underwriting. The collateral legally bound to this massive debt was the very house I was currently standing in. If this $300,000 loan defaulted, the bank had the absolute legal right to foreclose on my property and throw me out onto the street. My brother had not just stolen my jewelry, he had stolen the entire equity of my home. I clicked on the disbursement details, my forensic training taking total control of my actions. The funds had not been mailed via check. They had been wired directly into a newly formed corporate account registered under the name NextGen Tech Innovations LLC. That was Brandon's highly publicized, completely fraudulent startup company. The same company my parents constantly bragged about to their country club friends. The same company he claimed was about to secure a billion-dollar valuation. He had funded his fake executive lifestyle by secretly mortgaging my house. The sheer audacity of the crime was mind-boggling. To secure a home equity loan of that magnitude without the primary property owner present, Brandon could not just click a few buttons online. He needed to provide extensive identity verification. He needed to submit my original property deed. He needed to forge my signature on dozens of legally binding federal bank documents. But most importantly, every single one of those forged signatures required the official stamp of a licensed public notary. A bank would never disburse $300,000 without a legally sworn witness verifying that Samantha Miller had personally signed the mortgage agreement. Brandon could not have pulled off a federal wire fraud operation of this scale entirely by himself. He needed an accomplice who held a valid notary license. He needed someone willing to commit a severe federal felony just to get his startup funded. I closed my laptop with a soft, definitive click. The puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together in my mind, forming a picture so vile and deeply twisted that it completely erased any lingering trace of familial loyalty I had left. My father, Richard Miller, had been a licensed corporate notary for over 20 years. I stood up, gripping the edge of the desk. The physical pain in my stomach was nothing compared to the absolute betrayal radiating through my chest. My father had not just come to my house today to protect his golden boy son from an eviction notice. He had come here to protect his co-conspirator. My parents knew exactly how Brandon was funding his luxurious influencer lifestyle. They knew Brandon had forged my signature. They knew my father had illegally stamped those bank documents to push the loan through. They had literally gambled my entire livelihood, my home, and my financial future, just to keep their precious son from looking like a failure. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient daughter who would eventually find out about the loan and be too scared to report her own family to the authorities. They thought they could trap me under a mountain of debt, forcing me to stay silent, while they lived like royalty on my stolen equity. I picked up the printed eviction notice I had brought upstairs, my grip tightening until my knuckles turned white. They wanted to play high-stakes financial games. They wanted to commit federal bank fraud and hide behind the excuse of family loyalty. I turned toward the bedroom door, leaving Monique and her pathetic packing behind. I was going back downstairs, and I was going to tear their entire world apart brick by brick. I descended the wooden staircase with a heavy, deliberate tread, completely ignoring the fiery pain lacing through my abdomen. The physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the icy, razor-sharp clarity taking over my mind. Every step I took felt like I was crushing the last remaining fragments of my childhood illusions under my heel. The scared, eager-to-please daughter died on the second floor of this house. The woman walking down the stairs was a senior financial forensic investigator who had just uncovered a massive federal crime committed by her own flesh and blood. When I re-entered the living room, the atmosphere was thick with toxic tension. Richard and Linda were standing near the sofa speaking in hushed, aggressive tones to Brandon, who was currently biting his fingernails like a cornered rat. Harrison was standing exactly where I had left him, his commanding presence keeping them pinned to that side of the room. When Harrison saw my face, his posture shifted slightly. He recognized the look in my eyes immediately. It was the exact same look I had when I walked into a corporate boardroom right before dismantling a corrupt executive board. I did not say a word as I walked straight to the coffee table. I slammed my laptop down right next to the eviction notice, flipped the screen open, and turned it around so it faced my family perfectly. The bright glow of the Federal Credit Bureau dashboard illuminated the darkened room. Right in the center of the screen was the undeniable proof of their betrayal. $300,000, I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings with absolute zero-degree hostility. A home equity line of credit taken out against my property exactly 14 days ago. The funds were wired directly into next-gen tech innovations. Brandon let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa, his eyes darting frantically between the laptop screen and his father. He was terrified because he knew I had found the ultimate smoking gun. Forging a signature on a federal bank loan was not a family disagreement. It was a severe felony that carried mandatory prison time. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father. A bank does not disperse $300,000 based on a digital signature alone, I said, taking a slow, calculated step toward Richard. They require a physically notarized document to verify the identity of the property owner. Someone had to sit down, look a loan officer in the eye, and officially stamp a forged signature with a state-issued notary seal. I expected my father to panic. I expected him to deny it, to throw Brandon under the bus, or to beg for mercy. Instead, Richard Miller did the exact opposite. He stood up straighter, puffing out his chest with an air of absolute nauseating arrogance. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, looking down at me, not with guilt, but with the supreme annoyance of a patriarch who had just been questioned by a disobedient subordinate. Yes, I stamped the documents, Richard admitted, casually crossing his arms over his chest, as if we were discussing the weather. I validated the loan. It was the only logical decision to make. The sheer audacity of his confession sent a shockwave through the room. Even Harrison narrowed his eyes, a dangerous predatory stillness settling over his broad frame. "You committed federal bank fraud," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You stole the equity of my home. I secured the future of this family." Richard barked back, his tone laced with heavy, unfiltered misogyny. "Brandon is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. He needs capital to rise in the tech industry. You are a woman, Samantha. You are 34 years old. Sooner or later, you are going to get desperate, marry some outsider, and all of the wealth you have accumulated will be taken away by another man. I did what I had to do to keep the money within the Miller family line. Brandon is my heir. His success is the only thing that matters for our legacy. Linda immediately nodded, stepping up to link her arm through Richard's. Your father is right, Samantha, she chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic justification. You have always been so selfish with your money. Brandon is a visionary. He just needed a temporary boost. You should be honored that your property is funding the next big tech empire. When he is a billionaire, he will pay off your little mortgage. You owe your brother this much. I stood there staring at the two people who brought me into this world. I looked at the wrinkles around my mother's eyes and the graying hair on my father's temples. For 3 decades, I had exhausted myself trying to decode their behavior. I had spent countless nights crying, wondering why I was never smart enough, pretty enough, or successful enough to earn their love. In that exact moment, the final agonizing chain of familial obligation completely shattered. There was no love to earn. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as a highly profitable asset to be liquidated whenever the men in the family required funding. I did not feel any sadness. The void in my chest was instantly filled with a dark, absolute sense of liberation. I reached forward and slowly closed the lid of my laptop. The loud click echoed like a judge slamming a gavel. You really think you are untouchable? I whispered, my voice carrying a lethal, terrifying calm that made Brandon visibly flinch. You think your twisted patriarchal delusion somehow supersedes federal law. You think because I am a woman, I will just bow my head, absorb a massive fraudulent debt, and let you walk away with my life savings? Richard scoffed, though a tiny bead of sweat finally formed on his forehead. You are not going to do anything, Samantha. You are not going to send your own father and your own brother to prison. You do not have the spine for it. I am not your daughter anymore, I replied, looking directly into his arrogant eyes. I am the senior forensic investigator for the largest financial oversight firm on the West Coast. I send men far more powerful and far wealthier than you to federal prison on a weekly basis. You are not my family. You are simply the subject of my next criminal dossier. Linda gasped, taking a sudden step back, as the sheer reality of my words finally penetrated her thick skull. You have 48 hours to vacate my property. I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding. When you walk out that door, you will cease to exist in my world. Do not call me. Do not text me. Because the next time you hear my name, it will be read aloud by a federal prosecutor in a court of law. I turned my back on them, entirely pivoting on my heel to face Harrison. The billionaire CEO was watching me with an expression of profound, undeniable respect. He held out his hand and I walked toward him, leaving the pathetic, crumbling remains of the Miller family, suffocating in the toxic atmosphere they had created. The eviction was only the beginning. I was going to tear their fraudulent empire down to the ground, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I turned away from Harrison and looked back at the 4 people standing in my living room. I had told them they had 48 hours, but the image of my shattered steel safe flashed in my mind. Brandon had not just forged my signature. He had violently destroyed a secure vault inside my home to steal my identity. Leaving them in this house for another 2 days was a catastrophic security risk. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not issue another warning. I simply dialed 911 and put the phone on speaker for the entire room to hear. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's crisp voice echoed off the walls. I locked eyes with my father. My name is Samantha Miller. I need officers at my residence immediately. I have a home invasion and destruction of property. My brother broke into a locked steel safe in my master bedroom and stole highly sensitive financial documents, including my property deed and tax returns. The perpetrators are currently standing in my living room and becoming hostile. Linda let out a piercing shriek. Richard lunged forward, his face twisted in absolute fury, his heavy hand reaching out to snatch the phone from my grasp. He did not make it past his second step. Harrison moved with lethal speed, stepping directly into Richard's path and shoving him backward with a single unyielding thrust to his chest. Richard stumbled and crashed into the coffee table, gasping for air, as Harrison stood over him like a towering wall of solid muscle. "Do not ever try to touch her again." Harrison's voice was a low, terrifying growl that froze every single person in the room. The dispatcher was demanding more details. I calmly provided my exact address and confirmed that the intruders were refusing to leave. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely devoid of the arrogance my family had displayed just minutes ago. "You are a monster," Linda sobbed, kneeling beside Richard, who was still clutching his chest. "You are calling the police on your own blood. We are your family. You cannot put us in jail over some stupid paperwork. It is not paperwork. It is a federal crime." I replied, my voice steady and devoid of any sympathy. "And you are not my family. You are a criminal syndicate operating out of my guest room." 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 patrol cars illuminated my front windows. 4 armed police officers strode up my driveway, their hands resting on their utility belts. When they entered the house, the dynamic completely shifted. Brandon, who had spent the entire afternoon acting like an untouchable tech genius, suddenly looked like a terrified child. He pressed his back against the wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. Monique had completely stopped crying, her eyes wide with genuine fear, as she realized her influencer privilege held absolutely no weight with the Seattle Police Department. I calmly introduced myself to the lead officer and handed him my driver's license. I showed him the eviction notice stamped by the court. Then I led 2 of the officers upstairs to the master bedroom. I pointed to the violently splintered wood paneling and the completely shattered digital keypad of my steel safe. He used a blunt tool to smash the locking mechanism. I explained to the officers, keeping my professional composure intact. He stole my social security card, my birth certificate, and the original deed to this property. He then used those documents to secure a fraudulent $300,000 line of credit. "I have the digital evidence ready for your detectives." The officers did not need to hear anything else. Destruction of a secure safe combined with identity theft escalated the situation from a civil eviction dispute to an active crime scene investigation. The lead officer marched back downstairs, his expression hard and unyielding. He looked directly at Brandon and Richard. "You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate this property." The officer commanded, his hand resting on his radio. "If you are still standing inside this house when that time is up, you will all be placed in handcuffs and transported to the precinct for felony destruction of property and theft. Move. Now." Panic erupted. Monique sprinted upstairs, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She did not bother carefully folding her designer clothes or packing her expensive ring lights with care. She began blindly shoving everything into black plastic trash bags, because she simply did not have enough luxury suitcases to hold her massive wardrobe. Brandon scrambled after her, grabbing his gaming console and shoving tangled wires into a duffel bag, completely terrified that the police officers watching him would pull out their handcuffs. Linda was hyperventilating by the front door, leaning heavily on Richard. They had come here to demand my obedience and force me to submit to their patriarchal rules. Instead, they were being physically thrown out of a house in the middle of the night, flanked by armed police officers carrying their possessions in garbage bags like common criminals. They had nowhere to go. Their credit cards were maxed out. They were heading straight to the cheapest, most run-down motel on the edge of the city. Brandon was the last one to walk out. He stood on the front porch, gripping the handles of his cheap duffel bag. The cool night air hit his sweating face. He looked at me standing safely behind the threshold, flanked by Harrison and the police officers. His pride was completely shattered, but his toxic ego forced him to have the last word. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you have won." Brandon spat, his voice trembling with bitter rage. You think you are so smart because you brought the cops into this. You are nothing but a jealous, miserable spinster. My startup is about to close a Series A funding round tomorrow morning. We are getting an injection of cash from a billion-dollar investment fund. I am going to be richer than you could ever comprehend. And when I am a billionaire, do not you dare come crawling back, because even if you beg on your knees, I will not accept your apology. You are dead to me. He turned around and marched down the driveway, shoving his duffel bag into the trunk of my parents' car. I watched their vehicle speed away into the dark street, leaving behind nothing but the quiet hum of the neighborhood. I did not feel insulted by his threat. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I slowly turned my head and looked up at Harrison. The billionaire CEO of Brooks Ventures was standing with his hands in his pockets. He was staring at the exact spot where Brandon's car had just disappeared. A slow, chilling, predatory smirk spread across Harrison's face. He knew exactly what was going to happen tomorrow morning, and we were both going to make sure Brandon's spectacular downfall was an event the tech industry would never forget. The morning sun reflected blindingly off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows on the 40th floor of the Brooks Ventures skyscraper in downtown Seattle. I sat in a plush, ergonomic chair, inside Harrison's private executive suite, nursing a hot cup of black tea. My abdomen still ached with a dull throb, but the heavy dose of prescribed painkillers kept it manageable. More importantly, the adrenaline surging through my veins completely neutralized any lingering physical exhaustion. I was in my element now. Harrison had cleared a massive mahogany conference table just for me, setting up a top-tier encrypted workstation with 3 curved monitors. He stood quietly near the window, sipping his own coffee, giving me the absolute silence I needed to work. I logged into my specialized financial tracking software, bypassing standard banking firewalls, with the legal forensic credentials I held as a senior investigator. I needed to know exactly where my stolen $300,000 had gone. I started with the initial wire transfer from the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The bank had deposited the exact sum of $300,000 into a newly minted corporate checking account registered to Next Gen Tech Innovations. From there, Brandon should have theoretically allocated the capital towards server hosting, software engineering, payroll, beta testing, and marketing acquisitions. If he was truly building a revolutionary tech startup, the corporate ledger would show a clear, documented paper trail of technological development. I ran a deep diagnostic sweep on the corporate account ledger. The results populated on my center monitor in stark, undeniable red text. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching tightly. There was absolutely zero capital assigned to software development. No freelance coders had been hired. No domain hosting fees had been paid. No patent applications had been filed. Brandon had not written a single line of code. His entire company was nothing but a hollow shell entity created specifically to launder my stolen equity. I switched to my left monitor, tracing the rapid outward disbursements. The money had been hemorrhaging from the account at an astonishing rate. Within 48 hours of the loan clearing, Brandon had authorized a massive wire transfer of $25,000 to a luxury boutique in Beverly Hills. I cross-referenced the transaction with Monique's public social media accounts. There it was, posted exactly 3 days ago. A picture of Monique posing in my stolen master bedroom, holding a rare limited edition Hermes Birkin bag, complete with a caption bragging about how her billionaire CEO husband spoils her for no reason. The fraudulent spending did not stop at designer handbags. I tracked another massive deduction of $40,000 wired directly to an elite exotic car dealership downtown. It was a prepaid 6-month lease for a custom-painted Porsche 911. Again, a quick search of Monique's influencer profile showed her draped over the hood of the exact same sports car, claiming she and her husband had just purchased their absolute dream vehicle. They were literally burning through my life savings to fund a fake internet aesthetic for strangers online. I kept scrolling through the transaction history. I found thousands of dollars dropped on 5-star dining, premium champagne, and luxury spa retreats. Brandon was actively playing the role of a wealthy tech founder, treating his friends to extravagant nights out, using the money he illegally siphoned from my property. But the most sickening discovery was yet to come. I noticed a highly suspicious, heavily obscured wire transfer of $80,000 routed through a secondary shell account before disappearing into an offshore financial institution. I utilized a federal tracking algorithm to strip away the routing layers. The final destination was an offshore sports betting syndicate known for handling high-stakes, illegal gambling debts. I leaned back in my chair, the sickening reality washing over me. This was exactly why my father Richard had been so eager to commit federal notary fraud. He was not just trying to help his golden boy launch a business. Richard had massive, suffocating gambling debts that he had managed to keep hidden from his arrogant country club crowd. He had actively conspired with Brandon to steal the equity of my home specifically to save his own skin from illegal bookies. My father had stood in my living room yesterday preaching about family loyalty and protecting the Miller legacy while secretly using his daughter as a human shield to pay off his own criminal gambling addiction. They had essentially sacrificed my financial future to cover Richard's illegal debts and fund Monique's luxury shopping addiction. I highlighted every single fraudulent transaction, taking detailed digital screenshots and compiling them into a heavily encrypted, meticulously organized master file. I categorized the evidence under wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. It was a beautifully structured, undeniable roadmap of their criminal enterprise. A federal prosecutor would not even have to work for a conviction. I was preparing to hand them the entire case on a silver platter. I let out a sharp, cold breath and pushed my chair back slightly. Harrison turned away from the window and walked over to stand directly behind me. He looked at the three monitors, his sharp eyes instantly absorbing the highlighted data points, the offshore routing numbers, and the photos of Monique's designer purchases. He did not look surprised. He looked like a predator, analyzing a trapped prey. They did not build a company. I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet glass office. They built a criminal syndicate, using my identity as the foundation. They stole my money to pay off illegal gambling debts and buy luxury cars. Harrison placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm and steady, a grounding anchor in the middle of this chaotic betrayal. They thought they could outsmart a financial forensic investigator, Harrison said smoothly, his voice laced with dark amusement. That was their first fatal mistake. Their second mistake was threatening you in front of me. I looked up at him, a dangerous, absolute smile finally breaking across my face. I had the financial bullet perfectly loaded in the chamber. I had the undeniable proof of their federal crimes neatly packaged into a digital dossier. Now I just needed the perfect stage to execute the final blow, and Harrison was about to provide exactly that. Harrison walked slowly from behind my chair toward his massive mahogany desk at the far end of the executive suite. The morning sunlight caught the sharp lines of his tailored suit as he picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was the daily briefing packet prepared by his executive assistants, containing the schedule's financial summaries and pitch decks for all the upcoming venture capital meetings. He held the heavy folder in his hand for a moment, a dark, completely humorless smirk forming on his face. He walked back to the conference table and tossed the leather portfolio directly onto the glass surface right next to my encrypted laptop. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "Open it," Harrison commanded softly, leaning his hands against the edge of the table. "Turn to the schedule for tomorrow morning. Look at the 10 o'clock slot for our subsidiary seed fund." I frowned slightly, pulling the portfolio toward me. My fingers flipped past the executive summaries and internal audit reports until I reached the venture capital pitching schedule for a firm called Apex Horizon Capital. I knew that name perfectly well. It was a highly aggressive, deeply resourceful investment fund known for injecting massive amounts of cash into early-stage technology startups. I scanned down the printed schedule for the next day. Right there, scheduled for a premium one-hour presentation in the main boardroom, was a company name that made my blood run absolutely cold. Next Gen Tech Innovations, LLC. I stared at the bold ink on the premium paper. Attached to the schedule was the official pitch deck submitted by the prospective founder. The cover page featured a sleek, incredibly expensive-looking graphic design with Brandon Miller listed proudly as the chief executive officer. I turned the page, my eyes darting over the executive summary. The document was completely filled with meaningless corporate buzzwords. Brandon was claiming to have developed a revolutionary proprietary algorithm that would disrupt the entire cloud computing industry. He was confidently asking for an initial seed investment of $5 million. He actually managed to secure a pitch meeting. I whispered, genuinely stunned by the sheer audacity of the lie. How did a man who cannot even write a basic line of code get into a room with top-tier venture capitalists? Harrison let out a sharp, cynical laugh. He bought his way in, Harrison explained, tapping his finger against the glossy cover page of Brandon's fraudulent presentation. He used a portion of your stolen $300,000 to hire an elite high-pressure public relations firm. Those firms specialize in packaging worthless shell companies into shiny, irresistible presentations. They aggressively lobbied the junior partners at the fund to grant him an audience. Your brother paid premium networking fees to skip the line and get a seat at the table. I looked up at Harrison, the pieces of the puzzle rapidly locking into place. Brandon had screamed at me last night on my front porch. He had bragged that his startup was about to receive a massive injection of cash from a billion-dollar investment fund. He was utterly convinced that he was 48 hours away from becoming untouchable. But Apex Horizon Capital is an independent fund, I said, my forensic mind analyzing the corporate structures. Why do you have their daily briefing packets on your personal desk? Harrison leaned closer, his blue eyes gleaming with absolute predatory satisfaction. Because Apex Horizon Capital is not independent anymore, Samantha. Brooks Ventures finalized a silent 100% acquisition of their entire portfolio last month. The ink dried on the merger documents 3 weeks ago. The public press release simply has not been issued yet. I personally own the fund your brother is trying to defraud. I sit at the head of their board, and I possess absolute, unquestionable veto power over every single dime that leaves their accounts. The magnitude of the revelation hit me like a shockwave. Brandon thought he had found the perfect group of wealthy, unsuspecting investors to fund his delusional lifestyle. He thought he was walking into a room full of strangers who would hand him $5 million based on a flashy presentation and a rented sports car. He had absolutely no idea that the man holding the keys to the vault was the exact same man he had tried to intimidate in my living room yesterday afternoon. The trap was not just set. It was a heavily fortified steel cage, and my brother was happily marching straight into the center of it. We need to cancel the meeting, I said immediately, my protective instincts kicking in. I can forward this entire digital dossier to your legal team right now. We can block his entry to the building and hand the file over to the federal authorities. He is actively attempting to commit wire fraud against your corporation. Harrison shook his head slowly. The dangerous smile never left his face. We are not going to cancel anything, Harrison stated, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal frequency. Canceling the meeting allows him to scurry away and try to defraud another firm. Canceling the meeting lets him maintain his delusion that he is a brilliant entrepreneur who was just unlucky. We are going to do exactly the opposite. We are going to roll out the red carpet. We are going to let your brother put on his expensive suit, walk into my premium glass boardroom, and stand in front of the top executives in this city. We are going to let him present every single one of his miserable lies. I looked at Harrison, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline completely overwrite the pain of my surgical recovery. You want to execute him professionally. I want you to execute him, Harrison corrected smoothly. He reached across the table and closed the leather portfolio. My firm has a mandatory policy for all high-level investments. We require a rigorous on-the-spot financial due diligence review before any terms are discussed. Tomorrow morning, I am temporarily appointing you as the lead forensic auditor for the Brooks Ventures Acquisition Board. You are going to sit at the opposite end of that mahogany table. And when your brother finishes his little performance, you are going to put your evidence on the projector screen and dismantle his entire life. I stared at the encrypted files sitting on my glowing monitors. The stolen home equity loan, the offshore gambling transfers, the luxury cars and designer handbags bought with my stolen identity. My parents had told me I was a worthless spinster. They had treated me like a disposable asset. They had risked my freedom and my home just to prop up a pathetic, lazy fraud. I looked back at Harrison. He was handing me the ultimate weapon and the perfect stage to use it. There would be no screaming matches. There would be no emotional family drama. There would only be cold, hard, inescapable federal consequences. What time should I be in the boardroom? I asked, my voice completely steady. Harrison straightened his posture, buttoning his suit jacket with a look of pure anticipation. The meeting begins at exactly 10 o'clock. Dress for a slaughter, Samantha. Because tomorrow morning, we are locking the doors, and nobody from your family is walking out of this building as a free citizen. The sleek glass doors of the Brooks Ventures corporate tower slid open. Brandon Miller stepped into the expansive marble-floored lobby like a conquering king returning to claim his throne. He was wearing a brand-new tailored Italian suit that had been purchased just 24 hours ago. The crisp fabric, the silk tie, and the designer leather shoes squeaking softly against the polished stone were all paid for entirely by the fraudulent home equity loan he had illegally secured against my property. He adjusted his cuffs with a profound sense of self-importance, completely convinced that he was the next great visionary of the tech industry. Right beside him walked Monique. She did not just enter the building, she paraded into it. She was dressed head to toe in aggressive luxury, holding the exact same limited edition Hermes Birkin bag she had proudly flaunted on social media the day before. Her free hand was fully occupied by an expensive smartphone mounted on a motorized stabilizing gimbal. The bright ring light attached to the device illuminated her face as she actively live-streamed their arrival to her audience of internet strangers. "Good morning to all my beautiful followers," Monique cooed into the camera, tossing her long, meticulously styled hair over her shoulder. She spun around slowly, making sure the camera captured the towering modern architecture of the corporate lobby and the intimidating security personnel stationed at the entry gates. "We are currently walking into one of the most exclusive investment firms on the entire West Coast. My brilliant husband is about to close a massive funding round for his tech startup. I always told you guys that manifesting your reality works. When you are married to a true genius, the billionaire lifestyle just naturally follows. Drop some fire emojis in the chat if you are ready to see us secure this bag." She tilted the camera toward Brandon, who offered a practiced, arrogant smirk to the lens. He gave a casual two-finger salute to the livestream, absolutely soaking in the fake digital validation. They looked like the perfect picture of modern, unbothered success. They looked like people who had not been thrown out of a house by armed police officers just 2 nights ago. Trailing right behind the happy couple were Richard and Linda. My parents had dressed for the occasion as if they were attending a royal coronation. Richard wore a stiff, traditional business suit carrying a leather briefcase that likely contained nothing but Brandon's worthless buzzword-filled presentation documents. Linda was wearing a heavy pearl necklace and a designer dress, holding her chin so high it was a miracle she could even see the floor in front of her. They walked with the supreme, terrifying entitlement of people who believed their own twisted lies. The family of 4 approached the massive minimalist reception desk crafted from a single block of dark granite. The front desk attendant, a sharply dressed professional who had undoubtedly been briefed by executive security, looked up with a perfectly neutral, unyielding expression. "Good morning," Brandon announced, leaning his forearms against the cold granite. He spoke with the loud, booming voice of a man desperately trying to sound important. "I am Brandon Miller, the Chief Executive Officer of Next Gen Tech Innovations. We have a 10 o'clock premium pitch scheduled with the partners at Apex Horizon Capital. Let them know the founder has arrived." The receptionist typed a few keystrokes on her sleek monitor. Her face did not betray a single emotion. Yes, Mr. Miller. The Executive Acquisition Board is expecting you. I will have the senior assistant escort your party to the VIP glass boardroom on the top floor. Please wait just a moment. Linda could not contain her bursting pride. She practically shoved Monique aside to lean over the desk, offering the receptionist a wide, sickeningly sweet smile. He is a certified genius, you know, Linda declared loudly, her voice echoing across the quiet, cavernous lobby so that several passing employees turned to look. This firm is incredibly lucky to get a meeting with my son before he goes public. You should see the revolutionary software he is building. He is the absolute pride of the Miller family line. It is just so wonderful to finally see his hard work pay off. The receptionist offered a tight, polite smile, refusing to engage with the inappropriate oversharing. But Linda simply could not stop herself. The adrenaline of the moment combined with her deep-seated need to validate her golden child made her completely lose any filter. It is such a relief, honestly. Linda continued waving her manicured hand in the air. We have had such a stressful week dealing with his older sister. She is a very bitter, miserable woman. She works some boring accounting job and she is horribly jealous of Brandon's success. She even tried to sabotage this meeting by throwing a temper tantrum and calling the police on us over a simple family misunderstanding. Can you imagine being 34 years old, completely alone, and so toxic that you try to ruin your own brother's billion-dollar company just because no man wants to marry you? Richard chuckled, placing a heavy hand on Brandon's shoulder. Give it a rest, Linda, Richard said, though his tone was entirely approving of her vicious rant. Samantha is a failure who lacks the mental capacity for high-level business. She will be begging for a handout by next month. Brandon here is about to secure the family legacy. We just need to go up there, look these venture capitalists in the eye, and show them what real corporate leadership looks like. Monique angled her camera to capture Richard's motivational speech, nodding enthusiastically to her live audience. Exactly, Monique chimed in, checking her reflection in the screen. We cut the toxic negative energy out of our lives and look at how the universe is rewarding us. Good vibes only today. A sharply dressed executive assistant stepped out from a set of frosted glass security doors. She held a digital access card and gestured elegantly toward the private executive elevators. Mr. Miller. The assistant called out, her voice perfectly measured. The board is ready for you now. Please follow me to the top floor. Brandon adjusted his silk tie one last time, taking a deep breath to inflate his chest. He looked at his wife and his parents, offering them a triumphant, greedy smile. They all nodded back, a united syndicate of frauds, liars, and thieves. They walked past the security gates and stepped into the polished chrome elevator, completely euphoric, entirely blinded by their own towering arrogance. They believed they were ascending to the pinnacle of corporate wealth and elite status. They had absolutely no idea they were stepping into a high-speed elevator that was taking them straight to a financial slaughterhouse. And I was already sitting at the top, waiting patiently for the doors to open. The executive assistant pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors of the VIP boardroom on the top floor. The space was a breathtaking display of corporate intimidation and absolute power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire Seattle skyline. A massive custom-built mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs that smelled of expensive polish and ruthless business deals. Monique immediately raised her phone, desperate to capture the opulent setting for her followers. But a stern security officer standing by the entrance stepped forward, firmly instructing her to turn off all recording devices, immediately, citing strict corporate non-disclosure agreements. Monique rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic huff, but the cold, unyielding glare of the guard forced her to slide the phone back into her stolen designer handbag. Her digital audience was completely cut off, leaving the Miller family entirely isolated in the real world. Richard and Linda confidently took their seats near the center of the long table. They leaned back in the plush leather, whispering excitedly to each other about how much money they were about to secure. Richard proudly placed his briefcase on the table, acting as if he were a vital board member rather than a disgraced unemployed man drowning in illegal gambling debts. Brandon marched straight to the front of the room, standing proudly next to the massive digital projector screen. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flair. He arranged his fraudulent pitch documents on the podium, cracking his knuckles and taking a deep breath. He fully believed he was the smartest man in the building, completely unaware that every single piece of technology in that room was actively logging his presence for a federal investigation. The heavy soundproof oak doors at the far end of the boardroom suddenly swung open. The ambient noise in the room instantly vanished. Harrison Brooks stepped into the boardroom. He was not wearing the charcoal suit from 2 days ago. Today he wore a razor-sharp midnight blue bespoke suit that radiated total, uncompromising authority. He walked with the slow, measured, heavy strides of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying composure. Brandon looked up from his presentation notes. He squinted for a fraction of a second as his brain struggled to process the familiar face walking toward him. And then, driven by a lifetime of toxic delusion and staggering arrogance, Brandon completely misread the entire situation. A loud, obnoxious bark of laughter erupted from Brandon's throat. He genuinely believed that the man who had physically intimidated his father and thrown them out of the house was nothing more than Samantha's broke, thuggish boyfriend. Seeing Harrison in this corporate building, Brandon's twisted ego instantly formulated a pathetic narrative. He assumed Harrison was some low-level employee, a security contractor, or a desperate man who had somehow managed to hustle an interview in the same building. "Well, look who it is," Brandon sneered, stepping away from the projector and walking boldly toward the center of the room. He puffed out his chest, throwing a mocking glance back at his parents. "I cannot believe this. Did my miserable sister actually manage to beg someone to give you an interview in this building? Or are you just here to deliver the coffee and set up the water bottles for the real executives?" Richard let out a booming, condescending laugh from his seat, slapping his hand against the mahogany table. Linda smiled wickedly, shaking her head as if looking at a pathetic beggar. They were absolutely reveling in the opportunity to humiliate the man who had stood up to them. Brandon closed the distance, extending his right hand outward in a wildly exaggerated, patronizing gesture for a handshake. He wanted to force Harrison to shake his hand. He wanted to physically assert his dominance as a supposed tech CEO over a man he viewed as completely beneath him. "You should really watch your attitude today, buddy." Brandon continued, his hand hovering in the empty air. "I am about to secure a $5 million seed investment from the partners who run this floor. If you ask nicely and apologize for disrespecting my family the other night, I might just tell the hiring manager to give you a job cleaning the executive bathrooms." Harrison did not stop walking. He did not slow down. He did not even glance at Brandon's extended hand. Harrison walked right past my brother, leaving Brandon standing awkwardly with his hands suspended in the dead space. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to plummet straight below freezing. Harrison reached the absolute head of the mahogany table. He calmly pulled back the heavy, oversized leather chair reserved exclusively for the chairman of the board. He sat down slowly, resting his powerful forearms against the polished wood, and lightly steepled his fingers together. He looked down the length of the table, his icy blue eyes locking onto Brandon with a gaze so intensely hostile it could have shattered glass. "Put your hand down before you embarrass yourself any further," Harrison commanded. His voice was not loud, but the lethal, booming authority carried through the acoustics of the room like a physical shockwave. Brandon blinked rapidly, a sudden, uncomfortable flutter of confusion hitting his chest. His extended arms slowly dropped to his side. Richard's arrogant laughter instantly died in his throat. Linda sat up straighter, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as the heavy, terrifying reality of the seating arrangement began to register in her mind. Nobody sits in the chairman's seat unless they own the room. "You are not here to speak with junior partners," Harrison stated, his voice a low, mechanical rumble. "You are not here to negotiate with the hiring managers, and you are certainly not here to secure $5 million for a fake company." Harrison leaned forward slightly, resting his piercing gaze squarely on my brother's rapidly paling face. My name is Harrison Brooks. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Ventures. I own the building you are currently standing in. I own the investment fund you are desperately trying to defraud today. And I am the man who holds absolute, unquestionable veto power over every single breath you take inside my corporation. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the deafening, suffocating silence of a catastrophic implosion. The color violently drained from Brandon's face, turning his skin a sickly, translucent shade of white. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His lungs seemed to completely forget how to draw in oxygen. His mouth opened, but only a pathetic dry wheeze escaped his lips. At the table, the arrogant smirks on Richard and Linda faces were completely wiped away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Monique clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, as she stared at the billionaire CEO sitting at the head of the table. They had not come here to pitch a tech startup. They had proudly, arrogantly marched themselves directly onto a financial execution block, and the executioner holding the axe was the exact same man they had threatened just 48 hours ago. Harrison interlaced his fingers, resting his hands on the polished mahogany table. The rhythmic tapping of his index finger echoed through the massive room like a ticking time bomb. Brandon was swaying on his feet, his freshly bought designer suit suddenly looking like a cheap, ill-fitting Halloween costume. The arrogant smirk had been completely wiped from his face, replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered terror. At Brooks Ventures, we do not hand out $5 million based on a colorful slideshow and a rented sports car, Harrison stated, his voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated air of the boardroom. We demand absolute, uncompromising transparency. We require a forensic breakdown of every single financial decision the prospective founder has ever made. Harrison leaned back in his heavy leather chair, holding Brandon's terrified gaze with the lethal calm of an apex predator. We never inject millions of dollars in capital without passing a specialized, rigorous due diligence phase. And for high-risk profiles like yours, I rely on the absolute best in the industry. Harrison reached out and pressed the silver intercom button embedded in the boardroom table. Send in our head of legal counsel and auditing, Harrison commanded. The heavy, soundproof oak doors at the far end of the room swung open with a smooth, heavy glide. I stepped into the boardroom. I was no longer the bleeding, exhausted woman clutching her stomach in the hallway of a suburban home. I was not the obedient daughter who swallowed their vicious insults, nor the desperate sister begging for basic human decency. I was entirely in my element, and I was armed for a slaughter. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored slate-gray power suit. The structured shoulders and crisp white silk blouse underneath projected pure, uncompromising authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, exposing the cold, analytical intensity in my eyes. The physical agony of my recent surgery was completely buried under a massive surge of adrenaline and righteous vindication. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor in a slow, rhythmic cadence that sounded exactly like nails being driven into a coffin. The reaction from the Miller family was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. Brandon physically recoiled, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed backward into the nearest leather chair. His mouth fell open, his eyes bulging out of his head as if he were staring at a ghost. He tried to speak to form my name, but his vocal cords completely failed him, resulting in a pathetic, dry wheeze. Monique let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Her hands flew to her face, her long acrylic nails digging into her cheeks as the absolute horror of the situation crashed down on her. The fake luxury influencer suddenly realized she was locked in a corporate vault with the very woman whose identity she had helped steal to buy her designer handbags. Linda stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The arrogant, loud-mouthed matriarch who had constantly degraded my career, called me a failure, and demanded I cook dinner while bleeding from a surgical wound, was rendered entirely mute. She gripped Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling violently against his suit jacket. Richard looked like he was having an active cardiac event. His chest heaved unevenly, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. The patriarch, who had arrogantly claimed he was protecting the family legacy by committing federal notary fraud, was now staring directly at his executioner. I walked the length of the massive mahogany table, completely ignoring their panicked, suffocating stares. I did not look at my parents. I did not spare a single glance for my sister-in-law. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my brother. I reached the center of the table directly opposite the projector screen, where Brandon's fraudulent pitch deck was proudly displayed. I set my heavy encrypted laptop down on the polished wood. The solid thud of the metal casing hitting the table made Richard physically jump in his seat. Harrison gestured toward me with a slight respectful nod, yielding the floor entirely to me. "Members of the board, please allow me to introduce myself," I said. My voice was a flawless, icy instrument of corporate destruction. It did not shake. It did not waver. "My name is Samantha Miller. I am the Senior Financial Forensic Investigator and the Head of Due Diligence for Brooks Ventures." Brandon let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white, as he tried to ground himself in reality. "Samantha," he choked out, his voice cracking horribly. "What are you doing here? You cannot do this. We are family." I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of any familial warmth, mercy, or hesitation. "When you step inside this building, you do not have a sister," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "You only have an auditor. And as the lead investigator assigned to next-gen tech innovations, it is my absolute professional duty to verify the legitimacy of your corporate structure, your capital allocation, and your personal financial integrity." I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly to make sure my brother felt the full, crushing weight of my authority. "I have spent the last 24 hours conducting a deep, microscopic diagnostic sweep on your entire financial existence," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "And what I found requires immediate severe escalation." Linda finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a terrified, fragile squeak. "Samantha, please. Your father and I just wanted to help him. You cannot ruin his big pitch. He is your brother. He is going to be a success." I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. The sheer desperation in her eyes was pathetic. She was still trying to gaslight me, still trying to play the family card, while sitting in a room where millions of dollars were supposed to change hands. She actually believed she could guilt-trip me out of exposing a federal crime. "This is not a family dinner, Linda," I said, stripping away her title as my mother with a single sharp word. "This is a federally regulated financial institution, and the pitch is already over." I stepped away from the table, turning my back on my mother and her pathetic attempts at emotional manipulation. I reached for my encrypted laptop and connected the heavily secured display cable to the boardroom projection system. I did not waste a single breath on meaningless pleasantries or defensive arguments. I let the raw, undeniable financial data do the speaking for me. I tapped the enter key. The massive high-definition LED screen dominating the front of the boardroom flickered for a fraction of a second. Brandon's colorful buzzword-filled title slide was instantly wiped out of existence. In its place, a blindingly bright, meticulously organized financial spreadsheet illuminated the dark room. "Let us examine the current capital allocation of next-gen tech innovations," I announced, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the boardroom. 2 weeks ago, a lump sum of $300,000 was deposited into the primary corporate checking account. According to standard tech startup models, we would expect to see immediate outward cash flow dedicated to software engineers, cloud hosting servers, and digital infrastructure. I clicked to the next slide. A pie chart appeared, completely saturated in bright, glaring red. Instead, the corporate ledger shows an expenditure of exactly $0 toward technological development, I stated, locking eyes with my brother. "You have not hired a single developer. You have not purchased a single domain name. You have not written one functioning line of code." Brandon gripped the edges of his leather chair, his knuckles turning stark white. That is proprietary research and development money. He stammered, his voice cracking horribly. You do not understand how modern startups operate. We are in the stealth phase. We are building brand awareness before we launch the product. Brand awareness. I repeated, allowing a razor-thin edge of mockery to enter my professional tone. Let us take a closer look at this highly specialized marketing strategy. I pressed the spacebar. The screen split into two halves. On the left side was an official bank wire transfer receipt for $25,000 routed directly to a luxury boutique in Beverly Hills. On the right side was a blown-up high-resolution screenshot of Monique's public social media account. The photo showed Monique posing in my stolen master bedroom holding a limited edition Hermes Birkin bag. Monique let out a strangled gasp and physically sank down into her heavy leather chair, frantically trying to hide her face from the glaring light of the projector. A $25,000 handbag is not a deductible business expense, I explained coldly. It is corporate embezzlement. But it does not stop there. Another click. The screen shifted to display a $40,000 transaction linked to an elite exotic car dealership in downtown Seattle, placed directly next to a video of Monique draping herself over the hood of a custom-painted Porsche. $40,000 for a 6-month luxury vehicle lease? I continued, my voice striking the room like a gavel. Followed by thousands of dollars spent on premium champagne, 5-star dining, and unauthorized offshore transfers linked to illegal sports betting syndicates. You did not build a company, Brandon. You built a highly documented, incredibly stupid money laundering operation to fund your wife's fake internet persona and your father's secret gambling addiction. Richard let out a sharp, panicked wheeze. He grabbed his chest, his eyes darting frantically toward Harrison, realizing that a billionaire CEO was actively witnessing his deepest, darkest, and most illegal secrets being broadcast on a wall-sized monitor. "This is a breach of privacy!" Linda shrieked, slamming her hands against the mahogany table. "You hacked into his personal accounts. You stole his private information. We are going to have you arrested for cybercrimes right now." I ignored her completely and moved my hand back to the keyboard. I had saved the most devastating, undeniable piece of evidence for the absolute end. I prepared to deliver the final fatal strike that would bury them all. "Before you call the authorities, Linda, you might want to look very closely at the next slide," I warned her. "Because this is the exact document I am handing over to the federal prosecutors." I pressed the key one last time. The luxury receipts and social media posts vanished. A scanned high-resolution legal document appeared on the screen, magnified so largely that the fine print was perfectly legible from the back of the room. It was the home equity line of credit contract. I grabbed a laser pointer from the podium and aimed the bright green dot directly at the bottom of the document. "This is the origin of the $300,000, I declared, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. "This is a federal loan secured against the private property located at my exact residential address." I moved the laser pointer to the signature line. The green dot circled the ink. "Right here is my forged signature," I stated. I was actively undergoing emergency abdominal surgery on the exact date and time this document was supposedly signed. I have the hospital records, the surgeon's operational logs, and the anesthesia reports to prove I was medically unconscious. Therefore, this signature is a blatant, undisputed forgery. Brandon looked like he was going to violently throw up. He curled in on himself, his breathing coming in rapid, shallow gasps. But I was not finished. I moved the laser pointer one final time, dragging it slowly to the right side of the signature line, stopping squarely on the official state-issued stamp of validation. And here I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm, "Here is the official notary seal required by federal banking laws to disburse a loan of this magnitude. A seal that legally swears the notary personally witnessed Samantha Miller sign this contract." The green laser illuminated the name printed inside the official stamp. Richard Miller. I turned off the laser pointer and looked directly at my father. He was completely paralyzed, pinned to his chair by the sheer crushing weight of federal evidence. The arrogant patriarch who had constantly belittled my career was now staring at decades in a federal penitentiary. "You did not just commit notary fraud," Richard said, my words slicing through him like a scalpel. "You engaged in a coordinated conspiracy to commit bank fraud and identity theft against your own daughter to cover your illegal gambling debts." I turned to face the head of the table, making direct eye contact with Harrison. He offered a slow, validating nod, giving me the absolute authority to close the execution. As the senior financial forensic investigator representing this firm, I announced my final assessment, I declared, projecting my voice across the massive boardroom. Next Gen Tech Innovations is a fraudulent shell entity operating entirely on stolen funds. On behalf of the Executive Acquisition Board of Brooks Ventures, I officially and permanently revoke your pitching eligibility. Your funding application is denied. Your company is blacklisted. This meeting is over. The echo of my final declaration hung in the massive boardroom, thick, heavy, and absolutely suffocating. Brandon sat completely paralyzed in his leather chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal, suddenly realizing there was no escape route. Richard looked as though the polished hardwood floor had simply vanished beneath his feet. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch of the Miller family was reduced to nothing more than a terrified, breathless old man clutching his chest in sheer panic. Harrison did not say a single word. He did not need to. He simply leaned forward with calm, lethal precision and pressed a small silver button embedded into the side of the mahogany table. The heavy, soundproof oak doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open for the final time. The sharp, synchronized, heavy footsteps that echoed into the room did not belong to corporate executives or wealthy venture capitalists. Two towering, broad-shouldered individuals, wearing dark windbreakers, stepped firmly across the threshold. The solid gold shields clipped securely to their belts caught the harsh glare of the projector screen, still illuminating my forged signature. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the White-Collar Crime Division. The lead agent, a hardened, deeply serious man, with a voice completely devoid of any emotion, stepped forward and locked his eyes directly on my brother. "Brandon Miller," the agent announced, his voice slicing right through the deadly silence of the executive suite. "Please stand up and step away from the table. Keep your hands where I can see them." Brandon could not move. His brain was completely short-circuiting under the sheer crushing reality of federal law enforcement. He let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper, his trembling hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles looked like they might burst straight through his pale skin. "I said step away from the table, sir," the agent repeated, closing the distance in 3 swift, uncompromising strides. He grabbed Brandon by the shoulder of his freshly purchased, fraudulently funded Italian suit and yanked him forcefully to his feet. Brandon instantly broke down. The self-proclaimed tech visionary, the golden child who had demanded I cook his dinner while bleeding from a surgical wound, began loudly sobbing like a terrified toddler. He cried out for his mother, his knees buckling entirely as the federal agent roughly twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable heavy click of solid steel handcuffs locking around Brandon's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the pristine corporate boardroom. "Brandon Miller, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft," the agent stated, reciting the charges with brutal mechanical efficiency. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "No!" Linda shrieked. Her voice shattered the glass like tension in the room. She lunged forward, her expensive high heels slipping awkwardly on the polished floor, but the second FBI agent instantly stepped directly into her path, holding up a firm, warning hand. Step back immediately, or you will be placed in handcuffs for interfering with a federal arrest," the second agent ordered sharply. Then he turned his cold, uncompromising gaze toward the other side of the mahogany table. "Richard Miller," the agent commanded, pointing directly at my father. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Richard tried to open his mouth, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to offer a bribe or a hollow, pathetic explanation, But his voice completely failed him. The absolute reality of the situation had finally crushed his bloated, toxic ego into dust. He was not standing in his suburban living room bullying his obedient daughter. He was standing in a high-security corporate fortress, facing the full, terrifying wrath of the United States federal justice system. Slowly, with his hands shaking violently, Richard stood up. He offered absolutely no resistance as the cold, heavy steel handcuffs were clamped brutally tight around his wrists. Richard Miller, you are being placed under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit bank fraud, notary fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. The agent read off the charges, permanently sealing my father's fate. The sight of her husband and her precious golden boy son, bound in federal steel, completely broke Linda's mind. The arrogant, venomous matriarch who had spent my entire 34 years of life tearing me down, criticizing my career, and treating me like a disposable asset suddenly dropped straight to the floor. Her knees hit the expensive boardroom carpet with a heavy, ungraceful thud. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the federal agents, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. She crawled toward the center of the mahogany table where I stood perfectly still. "Samantha," Linda wailed. Her face contorted in absolute agony, salty tears and ruined makeup streaming down her cheeks. "Samantha, please. You have to stop this. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them it was just a minor family misunderstanding. You cannot let them take your father and your brother away. They will go to federal prison. They will not survive in there." I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt zero hesitation. I simply stared at her, letting the cold, clinical detachment of my forensic profession wash completely over my features. "I cannot stop a federal indictment, Linda," I stated, my voice perfectly flat and utterly unyielding. "The digital evidence has been processed. The grand jury warrants have already been signed by a federal judge." Linda reached out her trembling fingers, clawing desperately at the hem of my slate-gray power suit. "You are their family," she screamed, her voice echoing with raw, pathetic, sickening desperation. "You have to save them. Save your father and your brother. They are your flesh and blood." I slowly reached down and firmly pried her desperate, clawing fingers off the fabric of my suit. I took a deliberate step back, putting distance between myself and her toxic presence, looking down at her with eyes as cold and unforgiving as glacial ice. "Flesh and blood do not forge federal bank documents to throw their own daughter out on the street," I replied, my voice echoing through the silent, highly secured room like a final fatal judgment. "Flesh and blood do not steal my life savings to fund luxury sports cars and illegal offshore gambling debts while I am lying unconscious on an operating table. You made your choice when you stood in my living room and told me I was nothing but a failure. Now you get to live with the exact consequences of your arrogance." I turned away from her, completely severing the bond forever. I looked at the two federal agents firmly holding the men who used to be my family. "Take them away," I instructed quietly, my tone signaling the absolute end of the discussion. The agents did exactly that. They forcefully marched Brandon and Richard toward the heavy oak doors. Brandon was loudly, hysterically sobbing, his expensive designer shoes dragging against the polished floor as he begged for a second chance that would never come. Richard kept his head bowed, thoroughly humiliated, utterly broken, and entirely unable to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The doors swung shut heavily behind them, sealing their criminal fate and taking the toxic, suffocating weight of my past away with them forever. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing the last physical tie between me and the men who had tried to destroy my life. The boardroom, which had just witnessed a brutal federal takedown, was completely silent, except for the pathetic, ragged breathing of my mother still kneeling on the carpet. I did not move to comfort her. I stood firmly in my place, turning my attention to the only other person left from their toxic, parasitic syndicate. Monique had retreated to the farthest corner of the room during the arrests. She was pressing her back against the floor to ceiling glass windows as if trying to physically merge with the Seattle skyline to avoid detection. Her designer handbag, the very one purchased with my stolen home equity, was clutched tightly against her chest like a protective shield. The paralyzing shock of watching her husband get dragged away in steel handcuffs finally wore off, replaced instantly by a raw, primal sense of self-preservation. She did not rush to comfort her mother-in-law. She did not ask where the agents were taking Brandon. Instead, she frantically fumbled with her smartphone. Her perfectly manicured fingers were shaking violently as she rapidly unlocked the screen. She was not calling a defense attorney. She was checking her absolute lifeline, the banking applications. I watched the exact second the reality of a federal injunction crashed down on her. Her eyes widened to comical proportions, staring at the glowing screen in sheer horror. She tapped the display frantically, refreshing the application over and over again, her breathing quickening into a panicked hyperventilation. The bold, glaring error messages were likely flashing across her display in bright red letters. Access denied. Account frozen by court order. The massive web of credit cards, the offshore routing accounts, the joint checking balances she shared with my brother, every single digital cent, had been completely locked down by the federal magistrate at my direct request. "What did you do?" Monique shrieked, looking up from her phone and glaring at me. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of the fake cultured influencer accent she normally used for her online videos. "My cards are declining. Everything is locked out. The screen says I have zero available credit. You froze my accounts." "I did not freeze anything, Monique," I replied, my voice projecting a cold, clinical detachment. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation froze them. The assets you have been recklessly spending are classified as material evidence in an active grand jury indictment for wire fraud and money laundering. In fact, you are holding a $25,000 piece of federal evidence right now. The government will be seizing that bag along with the luxury car you leased with my stolen identity." Monique looked down at the Hermes bag in her hands as if it had suddenly caught fire. Her survival instincts, honed by years of grifting and aggressive social climbing, completely overrode any lingering attachment she had to the Miller family. She looked at the door where Brandon had just been marched away. He was no longer a tech CEO on the verge of a billion-dollar buyout. He was a federal inmate facing decades in prison and a mountain of insurmountable criminal debt. He was entirely useless to her now. Linda, who was still slumped on the floor in a state of absolute shock, reached a trembling hand toward her daughter-in-law. "Monique," Linda sobbed, her voice weak, desperate and pathetic. "We have to call a lawyer. We have to find a way to bail them out. You have to help me figure this out." Monique looked down at the woman who had enabled her extravagant lifestyle for the past 3 years. The look of pure, unadulterated disgust that crossed Monique's face was chilling. She sneered, her lip curling upward in total revulsion. "Help you!" Monique spat, her voice echoing harshly across the massive boardroom. "Are you completely out of your mind? I am not spending a single second of my life helping a family of broke, pathetic scammers." Linda gasped, pulling her hand back quickly as if she had been physically struck. "Monique, how can you say that? He is your husband. You took vows. You are part of this family. Vows to a man who was supposed to be rich." Monique screamed back, her true materialistic nature fully unmasked for everyone in the room to see. "You two lied to me. You promised me he was a genius. You told me we were going to be a billionaire tech family. You said he was building an empire. Instead, you are just a bunch of cheap suburban frauds stealing from your own daughter to keep up appearances." Monique paced back and forth furiously, gesturing wildly with her phone. "I am a luxury brand creator. My entire image is built on wealth and success. I cannot be associated with federal criminals. My brand deals will be canceled by tomorrow morning. My entire reputation will be completely destroyed because of your pathetic, incompetent son and your gambling addict husband. You dragged me into this mess, and I am cutting all ties right now before I go down with your sinking ship." Monique reached for her left hand. She grabbed the massive, flashy diamond engagement ring that Brandon had proposed with the ring my parents had likely financed by draining their own retirement accounts just to make their son look successful. She yanked it off her finger with a violent, aggressive tug, not caring that the metal scraped harshly against her knuckle. She did not hand it back gracefully. She cocked her arm back and threw it directly at Linda with all her strength. The heavy piece of jewelry hit my mother squarely in the chest before bouncing off and clattering sharply across the polished mahogany table, coming to a dead stop right next to my encrypted laptop. "You can keep the stupid ring," Monique sneered, grabbing her phone and marching toward the exit with rigid, furious steps. "Use it to pay for his commissary account in federal prison. I am calling my publicist and my divorce attorney the second I get down to the lobby. I am filing for an immediate annulment based on extreme financial fraud. Do not ever contact me again. You people are absolutely disgusting." Monique shoved the heavy oak doors open and stormed out of the boardroom without looking back even once. Her high heels clicked rapidly down the hallway, the sound fading away until there was nothing left but a devastating silence. She had abandoned the family the exact second the stolen money stopped flowing, proving that their entire relationship was nothing but a transactional parasitic illusion. Linda stared at the diamond ring resting coldly on the boardroom table. The final crushing realization that her golden boy was going to prison her husband was a convicted felon. Her daughter-in-law utterly despised her, and she was entirely permanently alone, finally broke her spirit into a million irreparable pieces. Linda let out a hollow, agonizing wail and collapsed completely flat against the floor, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. I stood right beside Harrison, my posture straight and my conscience entirely clear, watching the total, uncompromising destruction of the toxic empire they had tried to build on my back. 6 months passed, with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally reclaimed. I stood in the center of my living room, holding a steaming mug of black tea, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and fresh eucalyptus. The suffocating toxic residue of the Miller family had been completely scrubbed from every single corner of my property. The custom leather sofa was spotless, the hardwood floors gleamed in the soft morning light. Upstairs, my master bedroom was once again a private, peaceful sanctuary, its reinforced steel safe replaced and securely locked. There were no ring lights, no discarded video game controllers, and absolutely no voices demanding my obedience. The doorbell rang briefly, signaling the Daily Mail delivery. I walked to the entryway and picked up a thick, officially sealed envelope bearing the distinct emblem of the United States District Court. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the final ruling. I did not need my forensic software to interpret the absolute victory printed on those pages. The judge had officially ordered the complete and total cancellation of the fraudulent $300,000 home equity line of credit. Because I had provided airtight, irrefutable evidence of federal notary fraud and identity theft, the bank was legally forced to void the contract entirely and absorb the massive financial loss. My property deed was perfectly clear. My credit score had been meticulously restored to a flawless 810. The financial chains my family had tried to permanently lock around my neck were shattered into dust. The justice system had not been kind to the architects of that fraud. Brandon and Richard were currently wearing matching federal-issued jumpsuits in a minimum security penitentiary. The prosecution had been merciless. Faced with my digital dossier, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged notary stamps, their defense attorneys had advised them to take a plea deal rather than face a brutal, highly publicized trial. They were serving back-to-back sentences for wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Brandon would spend the rest of his so-called brilliant tech career sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of his luxury suits and his monumental arrogance. Richard, the aggressive patriarch who had prioritized a fake legacy over his own daughter, was now just another inmate counting down the years. As for Linda, her reality was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. With Richard incarcerated and their financial assets completely seized to pay federal restitution, she had been ruthlessly evicted from her pristine suburban fortress. Her wealthy country club friends had blocked her number the exact second the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided her home. My mother, who had spent my entire life judging people based on their wealth and status, was now living in a cramped, mold-infested apartment in one of the most rundown neighborhoods in the city. She was surviving on a meager fixed government assistance check, entirely alone, with absolutely no golden boy left to worship. The low, powerful purr of a heavy engine broke the quiet stillness of the early evening. I looked out the front window of my fully restored living room and watched a sleek, midnight black Range Rover pull smoothly into my driveway. The headlights cut through the gathering twilight, illuminating the immaculate landscaping I had personally restored over the past few months. The heavy car door opened and Harrison Brooks stepped out onto the pristine concrete. He did not look like the intimidating corporate executioner who had dismantled my family in a glass boardroom 6 months ago. Tonight he looked relaxed, wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat and a soft cashmere sweater, his sharp features softened by a genuinely warm, admiring smile. I picked up my keys and stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. The crisp Seattle air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. My surgical scars had healed perfectly, leaving behind nothing but smooth, unbothered strength. Harrison walked up the pathway to meet me halfway. He did not greet me like a billionaire CEO addressing his top-tier employee. The power dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted since that day in the boardroom. We had spent the last half-year dismantling complex financial frauds together, working side by side to clean out the rot in the corporate sector. We were no longer just a boss and a senior investigator. We were absolute equals, two fiercely independent individuals, bound by a profound, unshakable mutual respect. "You look absolutely stunning," Samantha Harrison said, his voice a low, steady rumble that completely grounded me. "Are you ready for dinner? I made reservations at that new waterfront place you wanted to try." I smiled a real, unburdened smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "I am more than ready," I replied. Before I could step off the porch, my smartphone vibrated sharply inside the pocket of my coat. I pulled it out, glancing down at the illuminated screen. A notification displayed a massive, frantic block of text originating from an unregistered prepaid cellular number. I did not need forensic software to identify the desperate, chaotic writing style. It was Linda. The message was a pathetic, rambling mess of manufactured grief and aggressive manipulation. She was begging for a temporary bridge loan, claiming she was going to be evicted from her tiny mold-infested apartment by the end of the week. She talked about how cold the unit was, how her health was failing, and how a daughter should never abandon her own mother in her darkest hour. She promised to pay me back the exact second Richard and Brandon won their fictional legal appeals. 6 months ago, a message like that would have sent my heart rate skyrocketing into a massive panic attack. It would have triggered decades of deeply ingrained toxic guilt. But standing there on my porch, illuminated by the warm glow of my own home, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no pity, and no lingering sense of familial obligation. There was only a vast, incredibly peaceful ocean of pure indifference. I did not type a single letter in response. I simply tapped the screen, navigated to the contact settings, and pressed the bold red button labeled Block Caller. The digital connection was instantly and permanently severed. I dropped the phone into my leather handbag and walked down the steps toward the driveway. Harrison opened the passenger door for me, his hand resting protectively against the roof of the car. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, breathing in the scent of new beginnings and absolute freedom. Harrison closed the door, walked around to the driver's seat, and smoothly backed the Range Rover out of the driveway. As we drove away into the vibrant, glowing lights of the Seattle skyline, I did not look back at the house even once. My future was sitting right next to me, and my past was officially erased forever. The most profound lesson we can take away from this entire experience is that sharing blood with someone does not automatically grant them a lifelong pass to disrespect, exploit, or abuse you. Society often conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, teaching us that we must constantly forgive and sacrifice our own well-being simply because we happen to share the same last name. However, true loyalty should never be a one-way street where you are expected to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Financial independence and establishing firm boundaries are the absolute most powerful shields a woman can ever build. When you rely on your own hard work and know your undeniable worth, manipulators lose their primary weapon of control. They can no longer use weaponized guilt or fear to force your submission. We are frequently taught that walking away from family members is a tragedy, but sometimes permanently severing those toxic ties is the ultimate act of self-love and survival. You do not owe your hard-earned success, your home, or your peace of mind to people who only view you as a disposable asset. True healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are actively committed to misunderstanding you. Creating a chosen family built on mutual respect and genuine support will always be far more valuable than maintaining a biological family built on lies and exploitation. You have the absolute right to protect your peace and completely rewrite the narrative of your own life on your own terms. If this journey gave you the courage to stand up for your boundaries against toxic relatives, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your experiences in the comments below.